One final segment before we go to intermission. This is the showstopper. This is the curtain closer. We are going to have a wonderful fireside chat. Then we're going to have a short coffee break, and then we'll come back for the second segment. We have just a treat for you guys. These two members of Congress, Congressman Scott Peters from California and John Curtis from Utah, Democrat and Republican, both are just advocates, champions, serious bipartisan legislators. Yesterday, they introduced the House version of the Prove It Act. We're really excited about it, but I don't want to steal their thunder, so I'm turning it over to the two congressmen and my colleague from the Bipartisan Policy Center, Lesley Jantarasami.
Hello, everyone. Seems like every single previous speaker has mentioned the Prove It Act, so now we have the opportunity to hear directly about it. We're really excited. If anyone doesn't know, Prove It Act stands for Providing Reliable, Objective, Verifiable Emissions Intensity and Transparency Act. Prove It Act. So, Congressman Curtis, what does the Prove It Act do? Can you just tell us a little bit about it? Why do you think these types of data are necessary?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I could call it by its real name. I know it by the Prove It Act, so that was actually pretty impressive. And second of all, before I even start, this is where Scott knows I'm going to give Scott just a big shout out, Congressman Peters. There's really nobody, in my opinion, more genuine in Congress on either side of the aisle than Congressman Peters, and it's just an honor to work with you and be on this bill with you. So the Prove It Act, and Scott and I love to kind of enjoy this moment, like, okay, guys, it's a study, right? The amount of attention it has received, you would think that we were doing a major piece of legislation, but it's a study, and at the heart, it proves, in my opinion, that the United States is a leader in the way that we manufacture, the way that we produce, and what we do. And that information has been out there, but never really an official source, provided by an official source. And so this makes it an official source and proves how good we are, and at the same time may highlight some areas where we can do better. And I also think it's important to acknowledge those and start working on those as well.
Yeah, so anything you missed, what would you add?
I just want to say, again, I have to thank John for being a great partner. John did something really profound. You may not have noticed, when I came into Congress in 2012, there were a lot of Republicans who were just denialists about climate change, and John started the Conservative Climate Caucus. He's now got over 80 members.
87
members who say that climate change is happening and that it's driven by human events, and that's really an important place setting for us to work from. And I thank you, John, for doing that. I also give John a hard time about, well, now we got to do something about it. Here we are, working on a bill together, so that's really rewarding and I think productive.
Yeah, and it's not just you two, right? There's a lot of interest from both Republicans and Democrats. You had a lot of co-sponsors on this bill. So what do you think is bringing folks, along when you think about getting others on board with the bill?
I believe that they too want to know this information, right? I think that there's a sense of like, why wouldn't we want to know this information? What are we hiding? It feels like almost like that you're hiding something. And I'll make a point for Scott that he'll probably make, which is that if we want to claim that we're the best in the world, that needs to be real data, right? And I think me and a lot of my colleagues, particularly Republicans, like to claim that we're the best at this. So let's get the real data and prove it.
Right. I think that's why the Chamber of Commerce is supportive. We want, first of all, businesses are going to want to be able to sell clean stuff. And I think also when we get to the negotiating table in trade, we want to have the information to push back on the kinds of things we hear out of Europe, which is that they're going to impose tariffs effectively on folks without a carbon tax. We're not going to have a carbon tax. We could talk about that. I favor that. I thought it would have been a better approach, but that's not where we're going. In the absence of that, a metric that's X dollars a ton, we need to have information sector by sector about how we're doing in comparison to other countries, so that when we do come to the negotiate trade, we have the real ammunition and the truth, and we want to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add on that
Absolutely.
a little bit? I think if you look closely, a lot of what's happening in the market is driven by clean. And I tell a lot of my Republican colleagues, right, like if you don't care about the environment, you at least care about the market, right? And that you should be paying attention to this. And the world wants to buy clean. And so therefore, let's show and demonstrate that we are clean.
And maybe to add a little bit to that, so you mentioned that, Congressman Curtis, you founded the Conservative Climate Caucus in the House to work on conservative solutions to climate change. And so how does this bill kind of fit with that, and why is this issue generally something that conservatives should be focusing on?
So I spent a lot of time convincing conservatives they should care, right, about this. It's actually not that hard. And one of the things I like to appeal to is, do you want to leave the earth better than you found it? To this day, I've never found anybody who says no, right? And that I think it's important to start with those commonalities, right? Places where we share, and we don't have to have a big debate. And so if you want to leave the earth better than you found it, now we can have a really thoughtful debate about how best to do that. And I think for too long, Republicans have stayed on the sideline in this discussion, not brought our ideas forward, and then just complained about the Democrats' ideas, right? We've become really good at saying what we don't like. Well, this gives us, for the first time, an opportunity to step up to the plate and say, no, this is what we like, and let's have a debate about whose ideas reduces the most emissions. The second thing I like to say is, do you want to leave the earth better than you found it? And then can we all agree less pollution is better than more pollution? We haven't had to talk science and we get on the same page, right? And everybody agrees with that. And so now what are the Republican ideas? What are the conservative ideas that we would put out on the table that maybe haven't been there before or have been there but need support? And for instance, I'd point to nuclear as a really good example, right? Where Republicans have long wanted more of a discussion about nuclear. And so being at the table gives us a chance to put some of those things at the table. So that was kind of a long answer about like why Republicans should care about Prove It and why they should care about this whole dialogue. And I think it's just been a huge mistake to the extent that we've not been part of that conversation. I don't even think it's been good for our Democratic colleagues either not to have us they're a part of that discussion.
Yeah, definitely. And so speaking on caucuses, coalitions, Congressman Peters, you're an active member of the New Dems, the New Democrat Coalition, committed to working across the aisle to build an economy that works for every American. And so as we think about climate trade policy, is this an opportunity to support those New Dem goals for economic growth? How do you see that playing out?
Sure, we're very concerned about climate change. We're also concerned about American competitiveness. I just think we don't want to be caught flat-footed against other countries as we talk about American achievement. One of the things that's really exciting about climate action is that so much innovation is happening in our private sector. And I'll say, when I came to energy and commerce, a lot of the conversation I heard from Republicans was, why are we worried so much about doing this to America if we only count for 10% of emissions? Well, one reason is you want to show the rest of the world that we can have a high standard of living without just depending on dirty fuel. But the other thing you want to do is provide our businesses the chance to develop the technologies and strategies to deal with these issues around the world, so we can sell that abroad. And I think we're excited about that as New Democrats. And the Prove It Act, again, the data can only help us. And by the way, we'll sort out maybe if some of our folks are dirty, we'll know that too, where we have to make improvements and compete. But the whole idea of the IRA was to provide subsidies and financial support for better outcomes in the private sector. And that's still a work in progress, but it's very consistent with what we're talking about in the Prove It Act today.
Yeah, definitely. So I was remiss. I should have mentioned at the top. So this is the first panel, not only with members of Congress, folks who have just introduced bills. We also have the opportunity in this panel to hear from you, members of the audience, to submit questions. You can do it online in the chat feature in YouTube, or if you're in the audience today, we actually have a handy-dandy QR code that we're going to put up on the screen, hopefully. And you can take out your phones. We typically don't like it when you take out your phones during a panel, but in this case, take them out, scan this, and then you can type in your questions. So this is how we're going to do it, high-tech ways.
May we submit?
You can definitely submit a question to each other.
I'm asking John why he wants to ban meat.
Yeah, definitely. So speaking of that, actually, not really speaking of that, but opponents of the Prove It Act, Congressman Curtis, I've been hearing some of these sort of strange arguments, right? That Prove It Act's going to lead to a carbon tariff, which is going to lead to the WTO, enforcing some kind of carbon tax in the United States. So what is that argument? Like, what's happening here, and why are people getting so spun up about this?
I view that as a really positive thing. If they're getting spun up, that means that we've got something,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it tells you that something's here, something important is here. I do think it's disingenuous. Think for a minute that the claim that this is going to lead to a carbon tax. Let me come back to what we're doing. We're doing a study on data that's already there to have a government source, right?
Yeah.
How is that going to lead? Please tell me, like, anybody make a rational conversation, debate about how that's going to lead to a carbon tax. I do think, so the reality of it is the climate world is full of red herrings. It's full of excuses, right? And I think this is one of the reasons it's been hard for Republicans and Democrats to come together. And I think, one of the things that Scott and I enjoy is like we can take all those, we can push them aside and just deal with like what's right in front of us. So I'm not surprised by the attacks, and I'm actually encouraged because it does tell me, hey, we've got something important here. And it does mean that we have to do a little bit of explaining, which is unfortunate. You would think people would see this at its face value. And then I would also point out too, there have been a lot of attempts over the years for a carbon tax. Some of my closest friends in Utah are proponents of a carbon tax. Scott's a proponent of a carbon tax. It has been, all of those attempts have been unsuccessful. So how is it that all of a sudden this is the secret, right, to a carbon tax?
Can I just add to that too? I'm for a carbon tax. John's not. I thought it would have been even a better way to approach the challenge than the IRA, which has a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of cranks you got to turn, a lot of grants you got to fill out. But it wasn't there, and it was pretty clear that the Biden administration didn't support it, and folks in Louisiana didn't like it. The reason we have to do this is because there is no carbon tax, and we're not going to have one. We can't just say we got $100 a ton compared to your 110. We have to come up with this information in the absence of that easy metric. So if we had a carbon tax, we wouldn't need the Prove It Act. We would be able just to look at the number. But the fact is we don't have that. That's the reason we're doing this. So it's not going to lead to a carbon tax. It makes up for the fact that we're not going to have that information from a carbon tax readily available.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other things you sometimes hear is that, oh, this climate trade policy, their mind immediately goes to tariffs, right? And then that's an anti-free trade kind of an argument. So Congressman Peters, you are someone who is pro-free trade. You have supported free trade agreements with Asian Pacific nations in the past. So what's your reaction to this kind of an argument? And so are we seeing, there's opportunity here for peaceful coexistence of climate and trade and free trade?
First of all, I'd like to tell the Trump representative, we can rename it the Trump-Pacific Partnership, and they'll all get behind it, right? I think this will facilitate free trade. It's likely to abate efforts to come after us as a country and our industries. I think we should be ready, and in a multinational economy where this is happening all over the world, there's a lot of competition. We don't want to be flat-footed, back on our heels. We have to be ahead of the game. So we should have passed this law a couple of years ago and gotten started. But the second best time to plant a tree is today, and we should do it. I think without it, we're really going to be, we're playing defense, and I think this is not good for American businesses and workers.
Definitely.
Yeah, I like to talk a lot about not just carbon, but a lot of regulations that we put on U.S. businesses that are not matched by people importing into the United States. So think for a minute about, let's pick on China. So think about human rights issues, think about OSHA and carbon emissions, and think of all the regulations that are placed on a U.S. business. Why is it okay to put those regulations on a U.S. business but then allow somebody to import into our country without those regulations? So they're either important regulations or they're not. So if we're not insisting on them product coming into the United States, well then let's stop putting those regulations on US businesses. Now, that would cause, quite a dither, but to me it's the same thing. It's like, well, how is that okay? And so I think this is an important conversation, and it was really important to me to listen to that previous little conversation because I'm very curious about where this is going, and if there's a Trump administration, where this is going. And I would like a really strong dialogue about every regulation we put on a US business that we don't require on somebody else that gets to import into our country. And why is that okay?
Yeah, that's an important point. I don't think we've touched on that yet. So there are human rights and labor standards provisions of the bill. Is that right? Do you want to expand on what those are?
I do, and I think this is an important difference between the Senate version, and I think part of this was me saying, hey, look, this is bigger than just carbon, right? These are differences in how we regulate here versus other places. So let's do the study on those as well. Let's have that information. And I mean, it's remarkable to me that US business competes and wins almost every time in these arenas with this tremendous handicap. But let's at least acknowledge the handicap and if nothing else, inform consumers of the handicap. Let them make a more informed decision when they're purchasing something, and then have that conversation about, well, should we be doing more to level that playing field?
Definitely. And a theme that I heard come up earlier today in the conversations that we've been having is kind of this question of accountability and like who are we holding accountable, and how does this bill necessarily help advance some of those priorities that we want to have.
You can't hold people accountable if you don't have the information. We just sort of really, we need a study. And I was here for a little while, but all the panels have mentioned the need for this information. Some have even referenced the act. It's referred to Ways and Means in the House. It is through the Senate committee, and we all ought to be working hard to see if we can't get it passed. Like I said, it's got bipartisan support. I think the chamber's for it. API's for the Senate version. I think they'll be for our version. I was talking to a representative from Chevron today. They think it's a good idea, and I think there are some outliers, but we got really widespread support. It makes sense, and I hope you all help us as you wander the halls. Let people know that we should get this over the finish line. This should not be that hard, right?
It's a study.
Yeah, so Congressman Curtis, what else would you say about the pathway for this bill moving it forward?
Well, I think we all have watched legislation in Washington, D.C., and you've all seen really good bills languish and die. You've all seen bills with lots of co-sponsors languish and die. And I think this is where there's a big burden on the two of us to chart a course, to lay a path, to give this bill the highest likelihood of moving forward. And there's a number of ways to do that. Favorable vote coming out of committee is a big deal. Co-sponsors, that's a big deal. Industry weighing in, that's a big deal. And if we do our job well, you all have seen this in Washington, moments come along that you can take advantage of, and you usually can't define that moment until you see it. It's usually different than what you think it is.
But you have to be ready for it.
And if you're ready for it, your bill is then ready to take advantage of that. And I think if you look back over the last few months on how both of our staffs, by the way, let's give our shout out to our staffs, have worked on this bill, you'll see just tons of work to get this bill ready. Some of that's co-sponsors. A lot of that was seeing what happened in the Senate. How can we improve the bill over on the House side? What criticism was there? How can we adopt to that criticism? So I think the path forward, in many ways, it relies on our ability to work this and get it ready, and then look for that window of opportunity when we can actually get it into law.
Mm-hmm. So I see some questions now rolling in from the audience. Definitely want to encourage more. If you have them, please do submit through the QR code and through the chat feature in YouTube. But maybe taking a step back. So we've talked a lot about the bill, what it does, what its future is, why it's needed. But what is the bigger picture for both of you in terms of how this type of climate trade focus and the need for data is really important to a broader set of climate priorities? And so Congressman Peters, you work on a lot, permitting reform, methane, wildfire prevention. So how does the climate trade angle kind of fit into that bigger picture of what you're trying to do?
There's a whole list of environmental issues you have to handle to deal with climate and with energy security, by the way, at a time when, for the first time, we're going to have a spike in demand for electricity. We're going to have to stop battling each other over where the transmission is good or pipelines are good. we're going to need to build a lot of stuff and get on the same page if we want the air conditioners to stay on. But one of the things we need to do is give attention internationally to climate. You know, we are only responsible directly for 10, 12% of worldwide emissions, but we have a lot of influence over what happens in the rest of the world. I'd love to really start to think about foreign policy and how that affects other countries as they develop prosperity. What are they going to use for energy? And I think the United States has a real interest in our business community being involved in that decision. You know, nuclear is something we talked about. We had a lot of progress in the committee, almost unanimity about the need to move forward with that. But it's one atmosphere, and so I'm proud of what we're doing here. I think we're setting an example. We're creating a lot of innovation, but we need to deploy it around the world. Some of that will be direct investment, but a lot of that will be trade. And I think this is just one component of thinking about foreign policy through a climate lens, and I think we don't do enough of that.
Yeah, so I want to, this is us. I kind of want to give a contrast to that. So Scott's thinking internationally, and my mind actually went to back home in my district.
That's why you're in the Senate. You're in the Senate. You're not in the Senate.
So yeah, blah, 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 blah.
I'm for the Democrat, by the way.
I love to point out, that helps me. I love to point out that I represent a county, it's called Carbon County. And then I smile and say, what do you suppose, right, that they do in Carbon County? And I represent oil and gas. And I think as important is our look outward is our look inward, where we're failing, in my opinion. And we talk about transition, and all people hear is, you want to take away my livelihood, you want to take away my jobs, you want to, and we're just not doing it well. And I think an important part of this conversation is like, how do we do this right in coal-producing counties? How do we do this right in oil and gas-producing counties? And one of the ways for me to do that is to totally change the dialogue to, and people never quite know what to do with me when I say this, but you know, I've never seen any science that says that fossil fuels cause climate change. It's carbon. Right? Not the fossil fuels, it's the carbon that does. So let's have a conversation about direct air capture, carbon sequestration, right? And let these people compete for clean, affordable, reliable energy. That's all they want, is to be able to compete. And these people, and then this is where the Prove It Act comes in, is like, they too often question the data or what's been given to them. So let's give them good data, right? And let's make them part of the solution, not the problem. And when I go into these counties and I talk about, guess what, folks, you can actually be part of the solution, not the problem. They love that. They're game for that challenge. But when you come in and say, you guys are bad, what you do is bad, right, we lose them. And of course, they're going to fight us on it.
Definitely. So we do want to congratulate you. You referenced your election win there, so excited. You know, hopefully, you know, in the fall.
Did we talk about the margin, or is that okay?
We certainly can if you want. But do you, you know? So where are you seeing the kind of future in the, you know, if you're moving to the Senate? Are we you know, thinking about how to engage the Republicans caucus on climate issues, on this potentially this?
Yeah, I'm asked that a lot because of my work in the House, and I usually refer to the fact that when I came to the House, I had no idea that I was actually going to be involved in this, let alone how I would be involved in it. And I feel a little bit that way going to the Senate. I can't walk into the Senate on day one and say, hey, I got this figured out, follow me, right? And so I want to fold into the efforts that are already there. They have a Climate Solutions Caucus that's very effective. And so I'll be watching carefully to see how I can help the efforts that are there and also add my own voice.
Definitely. Okay, so question from the audience. How can the U.S. leverage the carbon advantage without inflaming trade relations? You have thoughts on that one?
I mean, we see it coming already. We're going to have a little bit of a spat with Europe. And it doesn't have to be mean, but it has, you know, we have to be armed. Like any business negotiation, it doesn't have to be inflamed. I think if we think we're going to prevail without information to defend ourselves, we're fooling ourselves.
Well, why is it a spat with Europe?
Well, Europe's already suggested that we're looking at tariffs on countries that don't invest, don't have carbon taxes essentially. And so, we don't. We're going to have to come up with a fair understanding of how this should be adjusted. Look, if you were Europe and we weren't spending any money on climate, you were imposing I don't know what they're at, $80, $100 per ton on your businesses, I think you'd expect some consideration on the other end. So it's not unfair. It's not that they're being unreasonable, but we have to answer. I think that's the point of having this data.
Definitely. And was that a motivator, for you?
Well, I would
supporting
just
this bill?
add, this is where I think it's important to talk about U.S. values. And they go beyond carbon. This is the human rights, right? The safety and other things like that. And I think this is a wonderful chance for us to make a case that we like to do business with people that share our values. And we're going to do that, right? And we're going to work for free trade where they share our values. And we're going to have that conversation where they don't share our values about how we adjust for that.
Okay. Another question from the audience. So after Prove It Act data gets released, what is the next logical legislative or policy step to help decarbonize U.S. industry, especially thinking about carbon disadvantages in other countries?
I'm just going to say, I think the market will take care of this, right? And I said before, consumers want clean.
I would say also, the other consumers who want clean are Japan and South Korea and the EU who buy our gas. And one of the things that I constantly hear is our gas is cleaner than Russian gas. I don't disbelieve it, but I can't prove it. And I'd like to have that information. Again, I think if you think in terms of markets overseas, I think having that information will only be to our benefit.
Mm-hmm. So actually, this next question is really related to that because it's talking about MMRV, so monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification. So if you can't prove it, but you think it's true, this MMRV framework is going to be really important to get at those questions. And so how do you see those efforts and protocols, best practices, efforts to standardize some of the efforts around MMRV playing into the policy conversation?
I talk about this a little bit separately to improve it in terms of fugitive methane capture, for instance, where, again, the demand I talked about for clean gas around the world has driven the industry to come up with a lot of innovations about how to measure methane. And we're better at measuring not just the presence, but the concentration of methane. We get different tools for different environments, windy environments, and so forth. Again, I think what you see is that we're driving toward more information, right? And that's not just a governmental, that's not just driven by the government, it's driven by consumer demand. So again, I think we're probably gonna find that maybe there's more information out there than we expect just because consumers have demanded it from industry.
Yeah, and I would just caution, when I hear government needs to figure out the answers, right, to standardize this, I would just caution and say government rarely does that well. Right. And what government needs to focus on is end outcomes without limiting necessarily like how we do it or how we measure it. I've already heard in my district, for instance, look, if the government mandates you measure it that way, here's the disadvantage. So I would keep us focused on end outcomes and be careful as a government not to get too prescriptive in how we get there.
All right, so Grace would like to know, what was the hardest part about working together on this act? What was the most successful and maybe, some of the other stuff you might not want to talk about?
Well, you may have noticed we just don't get along very well.
I think the hardest part of bipartisanship is, in general, is that there is a tremendous pressure for conformity here in Washington, D.C. It is a culture of conformity. You go with your crowd, you don't cross people, you don't raise a different idea. And if you do, Twitter will yell at you, and some people are uncomfortable with it. And people come here and they say, I'm gonna get to Washington, I'm gonna rock the boat. And then they get on the boat and they say, oh, it's rocky, let's calm it down, right? And just the notion of working with the other party is just it's sort of not universally adopted. But I think it's so rewarding and so essential because nothing happens here of any consequence and certainly of any longevity unless it's bipartisan. So, it's harder because you don't just get to sit around with people who agree with you and write down, what you think, your right answer is. You got to actually listen to the other side and figure out where. And John's been great. I mean, we're pretty good at listening to each other and learning. I learned a little bit about what he's got to face in Utah, and he's, obviously California's a whole different bag of chips. So I think it's just the hardest thing is just getting yourself in that habit, and then sticking up for what you come up with.
I love that answer, and I would only slightly add to it just a little bit more, and that is some of what holds things back here is the bureaucracy and staff who change is uncomfortable for.
Yeah.
And I think we ran up against some of that with this bill.
Right. The staff drives you to conformity too. So my staff, fortunately, I have to tell
Not
them,
our
they
staffs,
they get out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
Too
We're
bad.
talking about other staffs.
Yeah.
They're all looking at you, right there. All right, well, unfortunately, we are out of time. We are moving now to a coffee break. So go out there, grab some snacks. You cannot bring them back into this room, so go enjoy out in the auditorium. We are going to reconvene at 2:55 for the rest of the session. So thank you very much. Join me in thanking the congressman.
All right. I think that's the end of our run.